This is Psychedelic Frontier, and I'm here with Rick Doblin, the founder and president of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. We're here in London, where the film Neurons to Nirvana enjoyed its UK premiere last night. Rick, thank you so much for your time, and of course for your contributions to drug policy and reform. So my first question is, I'm really fascinated by the idea that this thing, MAPS, now a global leader in psychedelic science and policy, was once really just an idea in one guy's brain.
Right.
So could you walk us through, how did MAPS get started? How did it go from being a what-if to a reality?
Yeah, thank you, Cody. I'd be glad to answer that question. But let me start a little bit earlier at 1972. The MAPS I started in 1986. But the idea for really devoting myself to this field began in 1972 when I was 18 years old. And I had dropped out of college because I had, in my first year, I had done a lot of LSD. And I had found that the LSD for me was very difficult but crucially important. And it helped me to understand that I was intellectually way advanced compared to my emotional and spiritual development. In other ways to say that I was emotionally and spiritually retarded, and that, you know, the whole Western education too is mostly about educating your mind, and it's not really about educating the spirit or educating your emotions. And so I felt that that this was an incredible tool that could bring me into balance. And I also felt that the society was kind of a reflection, that we had this technology that was so miraculous, even more so even now today, but also that we didn't have the spiritual emotional maturity to handle it well. And I had been traumatized by the indirect traumatized by the Holocaust. I was born in America in 1953 and had distant relatives killed and had lots of relatives in Israel. So I grew up to really think about the idea of projection, psychological factors that caused other people to project evil onto others and then try to kill them. And then grew up during the era of the arms race with the Soviet Union and the whole nuclear weapons and being taught in school about duck and cover and, you know, just the whole fear of nuclear annihilation, you know, and then growing up with Vietnam and realizing I was in the last year of the lottery, so I had to figure out what to do about Vietnam, and decided to become a draft resistor. And so all of those things were kind of culminating, and then when I did LSD, it made me think that I had been lied to. I had thought that LSD made you crazy and that it was a really terrible thing, and yet I wasn't quite capable of handling it, to let go, to open up, to process. I was more stuck in a lot of ways, but it started helping me feel things in a deeper way, even though they were difficult feelings. And so I went to the guidance counselor at college, and I was unbelievably lucky that the guidance counselor sort of validated what I was doing. He thought it was an important quest, and then he gave me a manuscript copy of Realms of the Human Unconscious by Stan Grof, before it had even been published. And I started thinking, wow, this is putting together science, which I felt was essential for me in the search for truth, with the kind of sympathy with the full non-ordinary range of consciousness, and spirituality, and values, and it had this grounding and healing. So it wasn't about power, or I think a lot of shamanism can often be around power, but it was about healing, and I felt that that was the reality test. Can you actually make people feel better and be deeper involved in the world? So at 18 is when I decided that since I was probably going to go to jail for being a draft resistor, that I would devote myself to psychedelic research and psychedelic therapy, which I needed, and that one day I thought maybe I could offer to other people. Right, so I dropped out of school for 10 years, and when I went back to school in 82, at the same place I started, New College of Florida, in Sarasota, Florida, which is an experimental college without any grades. Everybody has to do senior thesis, and it's the honors college now of the state of Florida. When I went to it initially, it was a private school, and it had this tradition of all-night dances under the stars till sunrise with loads of people tripping, which they did not put in the brochure.
Yeah.
And then it also had this unusual situation of a nudist colony at the outdoor Olympic-sized swimming pool. and a woman who had actually studied with Jung, her family donated this pool, and she was one of the professors at school. So there's this nudist colony, this whole tradition of psychedelics, and that was part of what inspired me. So when I started back 10 years later, I spent that 10 years building houses and kind of get grounded in the outside world, and sort of little by little tripping, trying to make it so that I could learn to let go more and experience it. And I realized you can't do all of the work in the inner space. You have to put it out. You know, I was assuming that you could initially, and I was just like piling on psychedelics in higher doses, and just thinking somehow this is going to, you know, get me where I need to go, and it just didn't. And out of that frustration, I recognized I need to get grounded, and that's where I did this 10 years of building houses, and I became a contractor and all. So finally, I was ready to go back to college in '82, and then I went to Esalen doing off-campus study my first semester, and did this workshop with Stan and Christina Groff called The Mystical Quest. And that's where I heard about MDMA, and MDMA was legal at the time. And so I was shocked, because I felt like I came to the party late with LSD, you know, right as things had already been shut down and criminalized, the research was over, you know. But now here I found out about MDMA when it was still legal, and so this was this tremendous opportunity to try to help with this introduction to society. But when I learned about it, it had already become ecstasy, as well as being Adam, the code name for the word for it, as used by Leo Zapp in the underground psychedelic therapy. So it was clear that it was doomed again. But this was the Nancy Reagan "just say no" era, and that there was going to be this big crackdown. But that I could work with others. And this is where I discovered that there was this underground network of psychedelic therapists that had continued, that I thought had completely disappeared. Yeah. And so I started thinking, well, okay, this is something that is worth protecting. Plus, because it's legal, we can introduce it to a lot of different people who will then become witnesses in our lawsuit against the DEA when they inevitably move against it. So in '84, I started the first nonprofit. And it was actually part of this evolution of me as counterculture underground criminal, as what I thought of myself. And then finally, you know, being back in school and trying to figure out how to blend with the system, because I didn't want to be a criminal. I didn't want to be underground. I wanted to be kind of a mainstream, normal kind of guy, and just happened to be interested in psychedelics. And it should be legal. And so this nonprofit was founded by me and two women who were both out in California. One of them, Debbie Harlow, who had introduced me to MDMA, who was a psychologist. And the other, Elise Agar, who was friends with Laura Huxley and others, and sort of the woman who helped weave together the psychedelic community. And so we formed this nonprofit to collect energies to sue the DEA. And that's where I started realizing that you could work with the system, that part of the system is designed to help us fight the system. There's a lot of good things built into the mainstream. It's not all repression and, you know, police and, you know, trying to squash people's individuality and freedom. That there's parts of the system that promote, you know, new thinking and freedom. And so, and actually, we could give people tax deductions for fighting the system. It was shocking to me. So we worked on that for a couple of years. We had a DEA administrative law judge lawsuit once the DEA finally decided to move against MDMA, and we won that. The judge said MDMA should be Schedule III, and which meant it should be illegal for recreational use, but it should be legally available to therapists. But there had been a tension. We had everybody who was seriously involved practically in psychedelics on our board of advisors, and they were sort of evenly split, where a bunch of them were very, you know, government-funded scientists, even at major research universities, who were looking in some ways at drug abuse. That was the only way they could look at psychedelics, was through a drug abuse lens. And others were more independent in some ways. And so the split became, should we support the therapeutic use of MDMA, and everybody said yes. But then the other part is, what should we say about the criminalization of everything outside of therapy? which I felt personally should not be illegal. And everybody pretty much felt the same way, but around half the people didn't feel comfortable saying that as the organization. So, but I was, since I had helped start it and I was speaking to the media, that I would talk about how I felt that the whole system of prohibition was a bad idea. And that developed a lot of tension in the group. So we eventually managed to win the DEA lawsuit, but because of the sort of delicacy of this, I felt that that I didn't want to jeopardize what we were doing. I didn't want the group to split in half, because we got to this point where a bunch of people were like, we just don't want to hear Rick being a spokesman talking about prohibition being bad. So that's where I decided I would resign. And at the same time, what had happened is that we had won the DEA lawsuit, but the head of the DEA had rejected the recommendation, and MDMA was criminalized. And unfortunately, it became clear to me that the only way was going to be through the FDA. At least at the time, the culture was open to medicine, but not open to freedom, and not open to religious freedom or personal spiritual quests. So I decided that I would start MAPS. So that's the genesis of MAPS, is that I thought, okay, I've earned a certain amount of credibility, so I'm going to start this organization without any illustrious board of advisors, nobody that I would make uncomfortable. And so you need 3 people in Florida, where I lived at the time, to have a corporation. So one was an old girlfriend who we had a beautiful breakup under MDA one night. It was absolutely beautiful, where we decided throughout this whole night, it was gorgeous, and the stars became the foreground, and our conversation became the background, and we would just talk. And an old lover of hers had come into her life, and the question was, should she go with him or stay with me? And so by the morning, it was clear that she should go with him. And we did it in such a beautiful way. So she became someone who was Mary Beth Home on the board of directors. And then another was Phil Manhard, was a friend of mine who we used to go to Grateful Dead concerts together. And so these are 2 people who had no careers in psychotherapy or science. Basically, people that would let me do whatever I wanted to do and not feel upset at what I did.
Had nothing to lose.
Nothing to lose, and so that's how MAPS started in 1986. But the vision was that because, and this was sort of the naive vision at the beginning, was that since there were millions of people that were now using MDMA and were having wonderful experiences, I thought it'd be no problem to build a big organization. We'd get tens of thousands of members. Everybody would give $5 or $10. And before you know it, we'd have all the resources we needed. Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. A lot of people would rather buy their next dose of MDMA or ecstasy rather than donate it, and it seemed like, we weren't that likely to succeed anyway. So from 1986, when I started MAPS, to 1993, I was the only staff person. And also at the same time, I graduated college finally in '87. And I had planned to go to get a clinical psych PhD to learn to do psychotherapy outcome research with MDMA. And when I went to graduate schools and told them that that was my intention, they were like, well, it's illegal, you can't even do this research. And I'm like, well, one day we will, and hopefully it'll be soon. And if I tried to get into your program and then end up years from now telling you this is what I wanted to do, and I'd invested all this time, and then you said no, then it'd be a kind of a bummer for me. And so what I'm telling you now is, if I can't get permission for that research for my dissertation, I'll do something else. So I almost got into several pretty great clinical psych PhD programs, but in the end, nobody wanted to let me in. So that was 1998, and so now I was like, what if I can do with my life? And so I went home and smoked a joint. And a lot of times, thinking stoned gives you a chance to think outside of the box. So I thought, okay, my whole life has been focused on learning how to do this psychotherapy and becoming a psychotherapist and learning to do this research. But then I thought I had this pattern in my life that women had taught me, wanting too much too soon. And so I thought, okay, here's another instance where I want too much too soon. I want to do the science, but the politics is in the way. So I thought, well, maybe I should study the politics. And I thought, okay, where should I study the politics? And I thought, well, I need the credibility. And I remembered there was a fellow named Mark Kleiman, who was a drug policy expert, who had done an interview in the magazine, and during this interview, he had talked about our lawsuit against the DEA, and he was a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So I said, all right, I'll call him up and say, would you be my mentor? And encourage me, does it seem realistic what I want to do? And he encouraged me to apply, and I managed to get in. So that's how I ended up getting my master's and eventually my PhD from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, while I was at the same time building maps little by little.
Wow. That's quite the story.
Yeah.
I didn't know a lot of it. I didn't even know you were a house builder.
Yeah. Well, I was so lucky in that when I was 13, my parents, 12, my parents had a house built by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's. That my parents are still alive. They're 87 and 84, and they still live in the same house that we grew up in. And it was just gorgeous. And I learned how much the physical structure can influence your mood and openness, and that inspired me to get involved. But it was also because I felt like the psychedelic experience was so insubstantial and so fleeting and internal, and that I was, as I said, sort of trained as kind of an intellectual in a way, and I didn't have any physical skills, and I was totally ungrounded, and that's where I thought, building things would help me get grounded.
So you touched on your journey from a countercultural draft resistor to being, this kind of icon in drug reform now. More recently, I wonder if you had to do some soul searching in working with the Pentagon. I know MAPS has gotten some flack about working with veterans specifically, because it's like, are we helping the state commit war?
Yeah, it's really important too that one of my close friends is Torsten Passy, who's a psychiatrist who's very involved with LSD and psychedelic research. He's one of the European experts in psychedelic psychotherapy, but his father was a Nazi, and so he's been, and the Europeans tend to see the American military in less than friendly terms, and kind of expansionistic, imperialistic, and so he raised those same questions, as have other people, is what are we doing working with the military? And for me, I feel like in the 60s too, there was this big split, that those people that tended to be pro-Vietnam tended to drink alcohol, and those people that tended to be against the war were pot smokers and hippies and psychedelic drug users. And so for me, this idea of working with the military has got two parts of it. One part is that, and it's similar to the police, I mean, I don't think that we are naturally opposed to the police. I mean, I don't like murderers and rapists and robbers, and but the fact that the police also repress personal freedom through enforcing the drug laws has made it so that a large amount of the American public, sees the police as the enemy also. And at the same time, I think also our military has gone into wars that we never should have gone into, which is what I thought about Vietnam, and our political leaders have been sort of selfishly thinking that, President Bush, I believed that he thought he'd get reelected if he was a war president, and so he needed a war. And so I think that it's been delicate, and yet I think that this cultural split where we're trying to bring psychedelics back to the mainstream, we're also trying to remove sort of this big division between the police and the population, particularly the sort of psychedelic using population, and also trying to make it so that the military is an instrument more of defense than offense, and more of a protector of freedom and human rights rather than a violator of that. And so the question is, are we, by helping heal some of the trauma that is caused by war, making war more likely? That's been the concern. And I think you could say the same thing about, are you a military doctor? Or are you developing, new surgeons that now we have all sorts of ways to save people on the battlefield who would have died 40 years ago. And in a way, because of that, we have more post-traumatic stress disorder, and more people have survived. So my thought is that when I went into the Pentagon, it was a shocking experience. It was like this fearful kind of place. But at the same time, ironically, we were trying to do a project with the Marines, to work with Marines with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the Marines work for the Navy. They're part of the Navy. And so we had a meeting that Dr. Richard Rockefeller had arranged. He'd previously spoken to the Secretary of the Navy, who we knew, who was sympathetic to healing trauma. And so we had a meeting with the Navy Surgeon General, and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and several of their staff. And to my kind of delight and surprise and shock, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy happened to have been a classmate of mine from the Kennedy School, and we've been friends. We hadn't kept in touch. We, had different life paths, but a lot of people who were interested in military careers were at the Kennedy School when we were in our master's program. So I feel that by helping soldiers become sensitized to the emotional consequences of what they do and help them heal from trauma, it doesn't make it that war is more likely. I think it makes, at least from what we've seen in the veterans that have been healed and have been, in our studies, that by learning to navigate emotions, they become more willing to give negotiations a longer period of time to succeed, and they see force more and more as a last resort rather than a first resort. So I think that the other part of this is that by working with the military, which has been a counterweight in some ways to the DEA and the police, who also have massive amount of trauma, and we're starting to sort of make those inroads where we're working to try to recruit volunteers, police in our studies who've been traumatized by their work, that we're both, I guess, making military people, they will follow orders and they will do what they're instructed to do, but at the same time they're not like go out, commit war crimes, take MDMA, now it doesn't matter to them anymore. It's not that's what's happening. And then
it's not a numbing.
It's not a numbing thing at all. And then at the same time, we're getting the chance to heal a lot of other people with PTSD and bring more psychedelics into the culture in a lot of different ways, so that eventually I think we'll have loads of people able to be more proficient at working with emotions, owning their own shadows, less likely to project onto others, less likely to vote for politicians who just say, America first, we're going to go into this country and do whatever we want. So I think ultimately that it's a vehicle for peace more than a vehicle for war, and that it is delicate. We have been accused of greasing the wheels of the military machine, and that's caused a lot of soul searching, but I don't really feel that that's what's happening.
Could you share with us a recent success in psychedelic policy or in research that gives you a lot of hope for the future?
Yeah, well, let's keep on this theme of the military. I mean, for 20 years, we have been talking to the Department of Defense and the VA about working with MDMA for healing post-traumatic stress disorder. Initially, it's all about Vietnam veterans. There are still many, many, many hundreds of thousands of Vietnam vets who are traumatized from something that happened 40 to 50 years ago. So we were working from the ground up, and that we would work with psychiatrists and psychotherapists that worked with veterans with PTSD. And they would be interested in working with MDMA because they knew that the tools that they had available worked for some people, but not for everybody. A lot of people were still left traumatized. But we would hit these political obstacles, and then the permission would be rejected. We would never get so far. So we tried this in 6 or 7 VAs around the country. We had all these teams, and it just was perpetually frustrating. And then through Dr. Richard Rockefeller, again, through his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller, who's on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, we started working from the top down and tried to say, you guys got a massive problem. Last year was $5.5 billion in disability payments for 275,000 vets. And that's annual, and it goes up and up every year as more vets are diagnosed with PTSD. And so we were able to finally persuade the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense to let MAPS pay for some initial proof of concept studies with VA therapists in 2 ways, combining MDMA with prolonged exposure and cognitive processing, or couples therapy that they've developed, where one of the couples is a vet with PTSD, and then we're going to work with people who are resistant to cognitive processing therapy and see if MDMA, instead of our full course, if one experience of MDMA can prime people to do the psychotherapies that before were too painful and re-traumatizing. So that's the biggest breakthrough I think that we've been able to experience recently, is this bridge to the military. And the other key factor is the FDA. the FDA has, from the middle 60s through the 70s and 80s, squashed psychedelic research and then exported that kind of attitude all over the world. But starting in 1990, a new group of people at the FDA took control over psychedelic research, and they decided to put science over politics. And so the FDA has been pretty much an ally, not in favor of medical marijuana or in favor of psychedelic research, but in favor of science over politics. So that, combined with the openness at the Department of Defense and the VA, combined with a growing series of pilot studies that have shown MDMA to be really helpful, now we have the data to sort of suggest that maybe if we can scale up and do the work necessary and raise $15 to $18 million and treat 400 more people, that we'll be able to get MDMA as a prescription medicine in 2021.
It's an optimistic forecast. I'd love to see that happen.
Yeah, that would be terrific, because then I could go back to be a psychedelic therapist, which is my goal, the whole point of this.
Right. All right, so switching gears a little to a recent event that caught my eye. After annexing Crimea recently, Russia banned methadone, which was being used in the Ukrainian addiction treatment centers.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the situation in Crimea?
Yeah, the Russia, for a while, actually, in the 1990s, the only psychedelic research in patients that was taking place in Russia. And it was by Dr. Yevgeny Krupitsky, who was in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. And he was using ketamine in the treatment of alcoholics and heroin addicts. And we ended up supporting his work. And eventually Hefter Research also joined together with MAPS to support his work. And it was terrific because we had not yet been able to start in patients in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So we learned a lot about what the politics were in Russia. And it was because ketamine was already approved prescription medicine that it was available in Russia, and so he was able to use it for therapy in a different context and showed that it was helpful for the treatment of addiction. But later, Russia, went into Afghanistan, and a lot of the soldiers started bringing back opiates, and drug abuse became more of a problem in Russia. They started having a convertible currency. It used to be that the Russian ruble wasn't accepted anywhere else outside of Russia, so they didn't want people to escape with any money, and so drug abuse started becoming a problem in Russia. And they're just blind and black and white, and so they stopped the research with ketamine once ketamine started becoming a drug of abuse as well, even though it was in the treatment of addiction. And so they've got this idea that methadone also was never approved in Russia. And actually, it's interesting to note that there are some states where methadone is illegal. So even though methadone is approved in the United States as a treatment for addiction, once the FDA approves a drug and reschedules it, the states still have to reschedule it before it can be used. So if we make MDMA into a medicine and the FDA says yes, we still have to lobby in 50 different states to try to get the change happen in those states. And some U.S. states have resisted methadone. So what we see in Russia is really just a heavy-handed, simplistic thinking that never allowed methadone in the first place, and is got this idea that drug substitution, drugs that are less dangerous than others, that they don't go for that. So it's interesting. I didn't even know that they stopped using methadone in the Ukraine, but it's a terrible situation. And so now there is no psychedelic research in Russia, and on top of that, it's illegal to talk about the beneficial uses of illegal drugs. So one of the things that Albert Hofmann, when he was 100 years old, there was a big conference in 2006 in Basel. And MAPS had worked with him, and we were publishing the American version of LSD, My Problem Child. And one of the things he said to me was that he wanted to know if we would publish a Russian edition and a Chinese edition, because he felt here's these enormous populations of people who've not been exposed, they didn't have the freedom, they didn't have the psychedelic revolution of the 60s, and so we were able to, so I said, yes, we'll try to do this. We'll try to, and I found a Russian version, translation of LSD, My Problem Child, that had been made by people who were involved in transpersonal psychology in Russia. And so we offered to publish it, and they said no, they were too scared. They couldn't publish it. So we even we managed to find a Chinese publisher, and we got a Chinese edition, but we were unable to get a Russian edition. So the idea that it's not only illegal to do psychedelic research, but it's illegal to talk positively about illegal drugs.
Can't even talk about it.
Shows you how, lucky we are in a way in England and in America that we have certain freedoms that other people don't have.
On the complete other side of the political spectrum, you have New Zealand, which recently established a regulatory framework for new psychoactive substances that allows them to be marketed if their safety can be established in clinical trials. This is in contrast to the usual game of cat and mouse played by most governments, where new legal highs are banned as quickly as they can after they emerge on the market. It's just a constant process. So what do you think of the new framework in New Zealand?
Well, I happen to have been in New Zealand last month, and so there was a conference March 20th about the new psychoactive drug laws. And Matt Bowden of Star Trust is the one that was really the New Zealand citizen that behind this. And he has a company actually to market what he calls legal highs or social tonics. And he invited Ethan Nadelman from the Drug Policy Alliance, myself, Amanda Fielding from Beckley Foundation, and Brian Emerson from the British Columbia Ministry of Health to come speak, along with local police officers, to discuss this new law, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's a real drug policy forward step, because the tragedy is that because MDMA is illegal and other party drugs, drugs that have been used both for therapy and for recreation are illegal, that people have started looking at all sorts of research chemicals that are not technically scheduled. And a lot of those are sold instead of MDMA, and a lot of those are more dangerous than MDMA. And we've had a series of people that have died from PMMA and other drugs that they're sold as MDMA, and there's no drug testing. So it's been prohibition-related casualties and deaths, not related to MDMA. So the New Zealand population, I learned that they were progressive in a lot of other ways. Women first got the vote in New Zealand, and they were also the first country to legalize gay marriage. So this particular law is part of their progressive tradition. And what they've decided is that people are using these drugs. And if there's a way to take new drugs that are not technically scheduled, that are not technically illegal under the international drug treaties, that they will propose that there be testing done to show that they're in some ways sufficiently safe, and then they'll permit a legal market to be made. And it's about $1 million worth of toxicity studies that need to be done for each compound before they'll let them be sold. And so it seems like a really remarkable policy, because they're having a legal market for recreational drugs, which in the United States we're probably 15 years away from, or something like that. So I think it's a great step forward, and but it's designed out of a certain kind of recognition that tragedies are going to happen because of prohibition, and that we need to look at the problems of drugs and also the problems of drug control and try to find some balance. So New Zealand's sort of leading the way.
I have to wonder if they'll take a look at retroactively at some of the compounds that have been banned.
Well, that's a terrific question, and we asked that of them as well. I don't know if that's too loud to play. Well, we can wait just a second. But it's nice to be outside here, Cody, with you and the sunny British countryside, London, without the rain. Okay, so the problem is the international drug control treaties. So for New Zealand to say we're going to try a novel approach with unscheduled drugs is one thing, and it's a much bigger thing for them to say, well, let's take a look at LSD. LSD is physiologically among the safest drugs known to man, and that it's psychologically challenging, but physiologically incredibly safe. It's only given in micrograms, and you can have massive overdoses, and you're not going to have brain damage, or you're going to have emotional issues. But so I don't think it's going to happen there as a step forward, that they're going to look at currently illegal drugs and make them legal. That puts them so in conflict with international drug control treaties, that they're not ready to be a leader in that way.
Do you think that would have to happen at the UN level first?
Not necessarily. The UN is going to be the last. It's the same way like in the United States, where we have states that have approved medical marijuana, and we have 2 states that have legalized marijuana, Colorado and Washington. And that's going to take, it's going to take years and years before the country of the United States legalizes marijuana. You know, we're currently guessing 2024 is when marijuana will be legalized in the United States. It's a presidential election year, and things tend to move forward in those presidential election years. So I think the United Nations is, you know, this sort of international body that is going to be the last to formally change. It will happen in certain countries, the same way that certain countries have now moved towards medical marijuana and have permitted medical marijuana production by for-profit companies. You know, change will bubble up, not start from the top down.
Right. They'll be the last bastion of prohibition.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're terrible. The International Narcotic Control Board is really a dinosaur.
Thanks. At a screening of Neurons to Nirvana here in London last night, you disagreed with Dr. David Nutt. He said that hard drugs like heroin and crack should never be legally available for purchase, whereas you argued that legalization is actually more important for the most dangerous drugs.
Yeah.
Could you explain why that is?
Well, I think that the most dangerous drugs, people are going to get into more problems with them. And when you have prohibition, people that are experimenting with drugs that are illegal, they don't want to ask for help because then they're scared they're going to be busted too. And at the same time, the drugs that are, what he was concerned about was overdose deaths from heroin.
Right.
So when you have heroin of unknown purity, dealers will give you, you know, X purity this time, X purity that time, and you don't know. And there's a lot of, you know, he said, you know, celebrities that die from rich people that die from overdoses. But would that be less if they knew exactly what they were getting? I think so. So I think that the more dangerous the drug, the more important it is that it be legal, so that, first off, people are not stigmatized. They're willing to get help when there's a short-term crisis, an acute crisis, and they're willing to seek drug treatment. And what we see is that a series of countries have done experiments, Switzerland, Canada, even the United States, with heroin maintenance programs. So heroin addicts in small experimental settings have been able to get free heroin. And you find that when you provide free heroin to heroin addicts, that they can hold a job, that they're not constantly stealing to try to make money to buy it. And at the same time, they're willing to stabilize their lives enough to the point where a significant percentage of them ask for treatment. Not most of them, but a bunch of them do. So I think that we need to really look at who is getting protected from criminalizing heroin and crack cocaine. And I think we need to also realize that we're going to have, ideally, if you're going to legalize heroin and crack cocaine, you're going to legalize LSD, MDMA, ibogaine, all these other things, so that people will have a series of choices. And, you know, some people will gravitate towards the riskiest, most dangerous things, but most people will not. And so I really felt that that it was important to say that in the vision that we have of future drug policy, that it's not that the good drugs like marijuana and MDMA and LSD and psychedelics, you know, will be legal, and we'll still be keeping all these other drugs illegal.
Which a lot of people think, even that's a progressive position. A lot of people do hold that. Like, we should legalize these ones, but never the hard drugs. That's
right.
Pretty common.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's a way in which it's a sequence. Of course, we're going to legalize the marijuana first before other things because we generally think it's less harmful and you know, beneficial even for loads of people. But you know, and it's delicate to say, okay, yes, if the society is so fearful of drug legalization that in a way what David is saying is, you know, you can be okay about legalizing pot because it's never going to go to these other drugs. But then maybe we'll learn about how it was a good thing to legalize marijuana. And all these dire consequences didn't show up that people had predicted. And so then maybe we'll be able to tackle the harder and harder drugs and look at them. So I think, yeah, you'd find most people, I think, would say that there are certain classes of drugs that should remain illegal.
Right.
But what did we learn from prohibition of alcohol? Hopefully that it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. When we ended prohibition, it wasn't because alcohol was deemed safe and a wonderful drug.
Right.
It was just that the harms of prohibition were even worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think the just from the point of view of, you know, who's making money and what their incentives are. When you keep heroin illegal, you've got all these people who do have an incentive in having people, addicted to their drugs. And so I think the other part of this is, though, should we have for-profit companies whose goal is to maximize profits market heroin?
Yeah.
That's a different question.
Right.
And so
Who's gonna make it?
while something could be legal, I think it's very possible for it to be. We're exploring this. What happens when MDMA is a medicine? It can't stay marketed inside MAPS because, as a medicine, the potential interest in it and the volume would mean that there's sort of money coming in that would dwarf the donations that we get, and therefore we can't keep that in a nonprofit. We need to pay taxes on it. So what we're thinking is of forming what's called the benefit corp. And I think we saw Neurons to Nirvana. Last night, one of the executive producers is a fellow named Mark Akbar, and he did a documentary called The Corporation. And it was about how the excessive growth, the focus on profit maximization, and he looked at the way corporations work and compared it to psychotic people and showed that it was very similar. So this idea of profit maximization without any other considerations is in some ways psychotic. So the state of California and a few other states have experimented with a new kind of corporation where it's called a benefit corporation, where it's for social benefit, and you can say that the goal is not to maximize profits, because if you have a regular corporation and you have any investors and stockholders, they can sue the management if the management isn't doing profit maximization. And so we don't want to do that with drugs. We don't necessarily want the for-profit tobacco industry trying to sell tobacco.
We don't need crack billboards.
Yeah. So I think that's where I can be sympathetic with what David Nutt is saying, is that a lot of people who imagine legalization, they think of it as, oh my God, we're turning it over to the alcohol and tobacco industry, and that's not going to be good either.
Right.
So I think some different kind of corporate form that takes social consequence, takes the externalities into account, that would be a better way to market these drugs.
So I have a more personal question. You touched on earlier your MDA, your romantic breakup on MDA, and you've alluded to your tripping in general. But I wonder if you have any especially memorable trips in your youth or recently that you'd like to share.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll share starting one that was when I was 21 years old. So this is sort of what helped me decide to work in this area. So my girlfriend, when I was 21, we lived together in this little house at the end of a dead-end road, but she went to study pottery in London, actually, and so I was alone for a bunch of months. And she was interested in throwing pots, doing ceramics and stuff. So I was all by myself on my 21st birthday. And I thought, okay, what should I do? I should take LSD and celebrate my 21st birthday that way. So I took LSD by myself, and I had this experience where, this is in the olden days where there were records, and I had a record player, and you stack a bunch of records on top of each other. And you know how when you do LSD, you get very absorbed in what's happening, and your time sense changes. And so there was this, I was listening to music and everything's fine, and but then the record ended and there was silence, and so I sort of lost track of the fact that there was records. And so the next record started with this noise that made me think that it was an air raid siren. And I was in Sarasota, Florida, and 60 miles north is Tampa, and that's the McGill Air Force Base. And my girlfriend's father actually was in the Air Force, and he was part of the group that was involved with bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they have bombers with nuclear weapons in Tampa. Okay, so I start to hear this, what I think is this air raid siren, and I think, oh my God, I just turned 21 and the Russians are coming, and they're bombing Tampa. And I had this quick, shit, my life is over. I was celebrating that I'm going to have all this, stuff to do, and I'm like, and then I had this thought. I remembered this Grateful Dead song, and the lyric, one of it was in the, let's see, how did it go? It was like, in the heat of the sun, a man died of cold. It was about how your mind can kind of influence things a lot. And so I was thinking about that, and then I was like, well, if I only have a few seconds, few minutes left to live, because they're going to bomb Tampa, I might as well live as much as I can in the time that I have left. And so I thought, okay, what I need to do is walk out of the house and walk towards Tampa and just sort of walk into the bomb as it's exploding. And that this is going to be the way I can, maximize the moments that I have left. So I walk out, luckily I'm at the end of a dead-end street. So I walk out of the house thinking I'm about to die, and I'm walking towards the direction of Tampa, and I am just noticing the incredible beauty of all of the nature around me. So all of the different shades of green between the bushes and the trees, and just how varied they were, and how normally you just see it as one big blur, and how I was like piecing it apart, and all the different colors in nature, and the colors in the sky, and the shapes of the clouds, and then the sounds of the birds, the sound of traffic. Oh, it was just like this exquisite. I was just soaking in life as much as I could. And I actually got down the road a little bit, and then I started hearing drums and guitars. And then I had this like, oh my God, what a fool I am that it was the record. It wasn't really the end of the world, but sometimes under LSD you think you're dying.
Yeah.
And, so then I was just like enormous sense of relief. But I also felt like I couldn't sustain that outer awareness of the magnificence of the world. And I felt like my awareness diminished a little bit. And so while I was relieved, I also was saddened. And so it taught me that LSD can, under the awareness of death, can help you totally be fully alive. And that's something that I've worked ever since to try to get back to. And I don't think I've ever really got back quite in that way. I'm now 60. That was 21, and I've done a lot of psychedelics and a lot of life, and but that moment stands for me as one of the most alive and alert moments of my life. And it was produced by a delusion, but the actual beauty of the world was not a delusion, and that's led me to really appreciate the value of LSD. So it's kind of an embarrassing story in some way.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's like hilarious and profound at the same time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think
Okay.
that wraps everything up. Thank you so much
Great,
for taking the
great.
time today, Rick. I appreciate everything you do
Yeah.
for our movement.
Yeah. I'm so glad we've had this time.